Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar called 5 Burning Questions Answered About Realist Evaluation. My name's Kevin Harris. I'm a senior lecturer at Solent University in Southampton within the UK. I am a senior lecturer at the university, mainly within the area of sport coaching and development. And throughout my PhD, I engaged within realist evaluation and mobilised it specifically within a collaborative environment with practitioners building their capacity to be able to apply realist evaluation. Alongside me is Henry Dorling, also from Solent University, and Justin Jagosh from the Centre for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis. I'm just going to hand over to them now, who's going to introduce themselves. So, Henry?
Yeah, I'm also a senior lecturer in sports coaching and development at Solent University. My interest in realist methods stems from the idea of monitoring and evaluation in sport development programs and how we get more evidence generation. Also, my PhD, which I'm currently about halfway through, is a realist evaluation of physically active teaching and learning methods in UK primary schools. So looking at the evaluating the impact of more movement in school classrooms with young people. Justin?
Okay, well, hi everybody. So my name is Justin Jagosh, and I'm the director for the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis. And I'm primarily involved in collaboration consultation as a realist methodologist on research projects, as well as training and mentoring individuals and teams in realist methodology. So yeah, that's all I'll say about me for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. So in terms of just going over the main objectives for this webinar, the main specific objective is that we thought that it would be a great opportunity to have a webinar that could celebrate the launching of our Realist research group at Solent University, which is actually officially launching on the 25th of October 2019. We've got a wide range of activities are in place for the actual event, but we thought it would be great to do something virtual and online as well, where we could focus on some of the burning issues and burning perhaps questions that lots of people have around realist evaluation and realist methodology at the moment. And I do keep a close eye myself on the Ramesses email distribution list quite a lot, and myself and Henry, we were thinking, weren't we, about some of the kind of like the key questions that come up, and they seem to be quite common, which is that basically we've come up with 5 in collaboration with Justin, and the way that the webinar is going to work is that we're going to work through each of the questions in turn, but try and have a nice kind of conversation around it as well, so that hopefully the people who are listening to the webinar can really kind of engage and kind of resonate with where we're coming from with these questions. And I'm quite hopeful that the answers that we come up with will help people kind of move forward with some of these issues. So I think now is a good time to maybe move on to the first question.
Okay.
So first question that we had is quite a common one that comes up, is how is realist evaluation related to critical realist philosophy? So Henry, you're going to give a bit of context on that.
So as Kev said, the Ramesses group is something we both keep an eye on, obviously quite a lot, and a lot of the questions are related to how people might fit their philosophies into realist methods. The Critical Realist conference recently, Kev and I attended. There's a lot of discussion around how philosophy fits in with or is versus methodology, and how critical realism is perhaps something that can be taken forward as a philosophy within the realist method. So Justin, perhaps you can enlighten us a little bit on the
Yeah,
first question.
you know, there's a lot to be said about this, and there's so many different angles and perspectives. And I think one thing that's really important to emphasize is that there's no singular kind of perspective on the relationship between realist evaluation and critical realism. Ray Pawson has written about it. There have been other people that have been, you know, writing about it. So there's a few points that we can make. One is, first of all, if you're talking about PhD students who are writing their methodology chapters, because I think that's, you know, where you have originally came from with this question. I think it's important that people who are working working on a PhD using realist evaluation, they should be writing a chapter on scientific realism as their methodological paradigm, not critical realism. However, they may also include concepts and explain the relationship between critical realism and scientific realism. But because I think that there is a bit of a misnomer here, there's a bit of a misunderstanding. People think that, you know, they're doing a realist evaluation and that the philosophical paradigm of realist evaluation is critical realism. That is not accurate, and I think Ray Pawson and others would also likely agree that really the paradigm of realist evaluation is scientific realism. So the question really is, what is the difference between scientific realism and critical realism? And I think that, you know, so there's a number of terms here, right? We have realist evaluation, we have realist methodology, we have scientific realism and critical realism. We have these different terms, concepts. So you know, we don't have time to go into like a full in-depth exploration of this, but one thing we can say is that realist evaluation based in a paradigm of scientific realism is a methodology. So it's a methodology that uses realist principles like retroduction, mechanisms, ontological depth, you know, concepts such as those, but it uses them in a pragmatic approach to scientific investigation. So this idea of scientific realism is really about you know, theory development and testing using a procedure, a scientific process, and using concepts from realism. This is different than critical realism, which is philosophically oriented. So questions around what is ontology, what is epistemology, what is the relationship between ontology and epistemology. It's not a scientific process per se, although in critical realism, there's a lot of work done critiquing and commenting on science and, you know, what is science and what makes science possible. But those are philosophical questions. And so, so that's one difference, is that realist evaluation is pitched as at the level of methodology, whereas critical realism is most often pitched at the level of philosophy. Although, even though there's a slight caveat there that there are people who are using critical realism, trying to use critical realism more as a methodology. So aspects, certain frameworks within critical realism, using those to push forward a methodological process. So does that make sense to you guys? Have I hit on anything there that resonates with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually one of those PhD students who posted one of those questions on the Ramesses page email back in 2014 now, actually, so 5 years ago. And I've actually got my response from the very man himself, Ray Pawson, in front of me. And I won't read the whole thing, obviously, because of time, but I asked that question about, you know, how do I apply what I'm doing within critical realism, and he says basically it is not possible to imagine that a PhD student can pick an epistemology off the shelf and follows it. If you have now read The Science of Evaluation, you'll see I started off with realist Bhaskar, but then drifted off to realist Campbell, making several important detours along the way. So, you know, very similar in terms of what you were just saying as well.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So this is what's interesting about realist evaluation and scientific realism, Pawson and Tilley's scientific realism, is they are influenced by thinkers in critical realism like Margaret Archer, Roy Bhaskar, but also people that are not in the critical realist camp, but also have a, an orientation towards scientific realism, such as Donald Campbell, Karl Popper, for example. So they have a different set of influences in contrast to critical realism, and Ray does include those influences in the first chapter of his book on the science of evaluation in 2013. So that's something that people have to work through, and I think that the main message here, the main point that I would make is that if you're especially for PhD students, if you're writing your methodology chapter, you should be writing a chapter on scientific realism and what scientific realism is, not critical realism per se, although then bringing in aspects of critical realism within that chapter would be very beneficial. And then there are other questions. I mean, people are trying to merge critical realism and realist evaluation together and doing some kind of sort of innovative sort of combination. I mean, there are benefits to critical realism in the sense that, it's a very open field for exploration. Critical realism is transdisciplinary. It reaches out into all kinds of domains: economic, the legal system, ethics and the law, women's studies, political economy. It's very, very broad. It's more sort of social science, humanities, as well as physical sciences, biological sciences. It sort of crosses all domains. And realist methodology, as it has been developed by Pawson and Tilley, is more focused on the evaluation of programs, services, policies, and interventions. So that narrow focus has also been a defining feature of how the constructs in realist methodology have developed. So how the definition of mechanism has been developed in relation to this more narrow kind of focus on the idea of evaluating programs, services, policies, interventions. So that is something to keep in mind as well. If you are applying realist methodology to something outside of program, services, policies, interventions, if you're trying to understand something at the societal level that is beyond any one particular program, then the whole concepts of Pawson and Tilley have to be sort of reworked in a bit, and people then start to look to critical realism, because critical realism does have this very broad, potentially very broad focus. So Margaret Archer's work also has a lot of layers, levels, that breadth to it. So there's an appeal there for certain kinds of research questions. That's what I would say about that question.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Justin. I think there will be a lot of students, PhD students, who are preparing for their vivas or their defences, feeling much more prepared to deal with that type of question that they might get from an examiner about when they say, how was your realist evaluation realist or critical realist, for example? So
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously there's more to discuss, but hopefully this will help people just kind of get on a certain sort of way of seeing it, and then they can read into the literature a bit better to try to find the answers. Okay, so shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, yes, please. So question 2. So question 2, if you base your program theory on your assumptions, then won't that be biased?
Yeah, so I think this one comes from perhaps people who are new to realist methods, realist evaluation, and they're grounded perhaps more in traditional ways to think about research and evidence generation, and they get a bit worried that the word assumptions, that if you make assumptions, then it's going to be biased towards your own experiences, and you need to have a broader way of showing the evidence, and perhaps that those assumptions aren't the right way to go about it, and program theory can't be based on own experiences, because that comes across as your own opinion, and in academic circles sometimes people get scared of of their own opinion, and without the backup and without any sort of really deep evidence base. So that's something to think about and talk about, Justin.
Oh, I think that was a interesting comment. You say how people can get scared of their own opinions,
Yeah.
or feel trepidatious about putting forward their hunches, their ideas, in the name of a rigorous scientific process. It's a very valid question. But I think one thing that's important to understand is that science, if you look at the history of science, going back centuries, I mean, the introduction of our hunches, our thoughts, our creative thinking, and our biases, let's face it, those are our biases, but in the best possible form of our biases. This has always been a part of the scientific process. It's only recently, sort of in the last century, that there's been this rise of what I would say is what people have described as sort of an empirical orthodoxy that suggests that but your theories are biased and that we need to look at the evidence with an atheoretical perspective. So without attaching any theory to it, let the evidence speak for itself and sort of see everything with a neutral lens, a very neutral so-called objective lens, which has a logic to it as well, because is it not the case that when you have a hunch and then you have a theory based on that hunch, and then you go to test that theory, well, you end up it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see what you want to see. I mean, that's absolutely a reality that can manifest. It's not a perfect science. Is not a perfect process, and so you could come up with a theory that of a particular claim, and then seek out evidence that then just simply supports your theory, whether or not that theory really does correspond to the actual manifestation of reality. So that's a concern, and that is the logic of a sort of an orthodox empiricism, that we should just allow the evidence to speak for itself and not impose our biases on the evidence, because that will lead us down, a rabbit hole, for example. But on the other hand, and this is where the realist perspective comes in, this is the realist logic, is that when you're talking about ontological depth, now I haven't really introduced this term yet in this webinar, but I have spoken about it, and you can read about you can go to Google ontological depth. The idea is that there is a depth to our reality, and that a way to get to that depth is to theorize, because when we're talking about empiricism or empirical reality, that's the level of reality that we can measure, that we can describe, that we can observe, that we can perceive. But there's actually a whole level, there's a whole realm of reality that is beyond our empirical measurement, or easy empirical measurement. That's where the mechanisms lie, for example. And so the idea with theory-driven realist evaluation is that we need to theorize that depth. We need to theorize those ontologically deep mechanisms in order to study them. Because if you're just saying, if alternatively, if you just say, let's just let the empirical evidence speak for itself, well, there's actually more to the story than just empirical evidence. And so if you theorize, if you present program theories that reflect ontological depth, then you will be able to test that ontological depth. So it's sort of like the saying, you can't test what you're not looking for. If you're not looking for something that exists, then that's hidden, how are you going to be able to unearth it? How are you going to be able to test it? So it's flipping this logic of sort of empirical orthodoxy on its head and saying that we need program theories because of the fact there's ontological depth. We need those program theories to help us gain an understanding of that depth. That's not to say that it's a easy thing to do, and that risk of bias is still there. But on the other hand, this is where it becomes very fascinating. One may argue that it is through our subjective, hunch-driven theorizing that we may get to a deeper objective reality. Does that make sense to you? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, yeah, I think so, and it kind of resonates with, from my perspective, as formerly being an industry practitioner working within sport and health within Southampton, and now as a realist evaluator working with practitioners to try and work with them to uncover and bring out their own program theories, and quite often those program theories take some time to try to bring to the surface based on how deep, in terms of the ontological depth that they have. So, in terms of those program theories that are within them, within their practices, because they're so close to what goes on, is so important. So yeah, that's kind of, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as well, I've been so I had to sort of defend myself in a sense when, particularly with school-based research, how could I go into a school with young people just on a hunch, just on an assumption about what might be going on, and this isn't the right way of doing it, and you need to have a much better level of evidence before you're able to go in and start to test out things that are happening, and that in particularly in that environment with young people in school and education, that's something that's been leveled at me in terms of, how can you do this without a solid block of evidential empirical data behind you to say, let's go forward and do all the research. So that's something that I've experienced.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's certainly challenges with doing it, and there are different sort of checks and balances you can put in place to try to really ensure that your program theories are not biased in that very unhealthy way, because they are your biases. So we're not saying that they're not biases. They're your hunches, your thoughts. And so if you're a practitioner, say for example, a practitioner working in the field for many, many years, you may have a deep understanding of how things are working based on many, many anecdotal sort of scenarios that come to your mind. It's in your memory. And so you can put together your program theories that are actually quite insightful, that reflect the ontological depth that we're talking about. And that then you can take those theories to stakeholders and ask them, like, does this resonate with you? And do some member checking, some validation, to try to make sure that they do have, consult the literature. So there's a lot that you can do to address this concern about bias. But I think that what becomes very rewarding is when people use program theories to direct their research. What they find is that they end up going into very kind of interesting exploratory space in their analysis. If you don't have those program theories up front and you're just sort of point blank doing an inductive kind of grounded theory approach to theorizing based on just what the evidence is telling you, then that ends up sometimes feeling like a summation, like a theory summate. You're summating what exists in the literature and what you can theorize from what exists. But it may not be the whole story, and it may not go to that ontological depth. And so when we engage with ontological depth, in other words, we are retroductively, so retroduction is the activity of unearthing mechanisms, then those program theories that reflect ontological depth that are done retroductively, the idea with realist paradigm is that those are actually more objective. Like the more ontologically deep your theories are, the more objective they are, because they're capturing a depth of reality that otherwise wouldn't be captured from an empirical sort of surface level theorizing of reality. So our understanding of what is objective and what is biased shifts in the realist paradigm. So that's probably what I would say about that.
Yeah, thank you, Justin.
Okay, so shall we move on then to the next question?
Yeah,
okay.
On to the next one. So question 3, if realist evaluation is developing and testing program theory, when do you stop testing?
Yeah, so another kind of area that people who perhaps aren't in or just starting to get into the realist methods and ideas, another sort of criticism they have of that is when we talk about refining your program theories and testing and refining, where do you stop at what point in that context or in those mechanisms that you're looking to test and refine, do you stop and actually decide that is what is working or not working? So I think that's probably a question definitely that I've had leveled to me before with my research, so probably as well as other people. So where do you stop, Justin? When do you stop?
Yeah, where do you stop? Where do you stop? I mean, it's a question that, you know, like you said, Henry, so many people are wondering, because once people open that door to theorizing the extent, say if you're studying an intervention and you realize that actually there are multiple components to the intervention, and even within each component there are different resources offered, so the different mechanism resources, and then there's also different responses. People have different, but then there's also different contexts. So there's so many parts to the whole process, and we're not going into it's not an introduction to realist methodology here. So I'm assuming that the audience here will have some understanding when I talk about mechanism resource, mechanism response, and context. So what happens is that people start to write their program theories. They have 10 program theories, and then, then 20, 30, 40, 50. Sometimes people get up to like hundreds of program theories that explain one little facet or one little possibility of how the program could work in this context with this resource or this mechanism and this outcome. And so what Ray Pawson has very brilliantly emphasized is the need for pragmatism. That's a very fundamental principle of realist evaluation, is pragmatism. Because we're working in a complexity frame and because we're exploring ontological depth, it's absolutely true that we could go on and on. We could explode this sort of theorizing process to the point where it becomes unmanageable from a human resource perspective. We don't have the time, the resources to investigate all that. But not only that, not everything that's theorized needs to be tested. There are certain claims that you may make about your program that are true, like that are, sorry, not that they're true, but they are worthy of consideration, but they may not have a direct utility in innovating programs, in innovating your program, in thinking about how you may improve it or modify it or maintain it. Certain program theories don't have a lot of weight. On the other hand, there may be some key program theories that actually are absolutely central to where the program is at in this stage. That's another aspect to it, is that given the development of an intervention at this point in time, you may say that, out of these X number of program theories, there are certain key program theories that are actually the most important to help us understand how we can maintain or innovate the program, scale it up, or expand it or refine it, so that it improves. Now, and the other part of that is that Pawson and Tilley describe realist evaluation being part of a cumulative scientific process where you have a project, and at the start of the project you might construct some program theories. You test those program theories. At the end of your project, you have these evidence-informed program theories. But those theories are now there for future testing. We are always assuming that there is a continuum of theory building and testing in a given field, that it's never a one-off. We lament this reality that evaluations are often this one-off project, where at the end of the project there are some conclusions, but then those conclusions don't get formulated into advanced thinking around program theories for another iteration. And this is very important when we understand that context is always changing, context is evolving, and in one given project we may not have uncovered all the variations in context upon which an intervention may be implemented. So we need to always keep that in mind, that at the end of your study, there's that pragmatic goal, and there's also this reality that you can sort of rest assured that whatever you produce, whatever your claim is at the end, it needs to be tested in the future. under new context, under new contextual conditions, and also because you may not have tested your whole, set of program theories in this one go. So you need to like explore the extent to which you can, develop your program theories to the best of your ability at this given time in your project. Pick those program theories that are the most pragmatic and useful to test now. Be transparent about that, and in your section on recommendations for future research, write about your sort of ideas of where the field needs to go from what you have done in your Realist project in that given time. So that's what I would say about that question. Does that answer the question, or does it make you think something?
Yeah, I think it does. I was just, you took the words out of my mouth when I said about this idea that context is always changing. Because I suppose there is always a rationale to continue testing within realist evaluation, because by the time you've finished testing or you've undertaken the evaluation, some time has passed and therefore the context has changed. So therefore there's a justification to go through the process again as well. But I think the that word pragmatic is key, isn't it? Because when do you stop testing, but also when do you stop developing program theories as well? That's one that always seems to come up in summer schools, isn't it, Justin?
Yeah.
When people
yeah.
say, I can spend so much time developing program theories here. How many do I come up with? How many CMOs do I come up with, for example?
Yeah, no, that it's true, and I think my advice to people, based on my personal experience and also in conversation and mentorship and consultation with others, is that there is a risk of overdoing the initial program theorizing. People may end up belaboring this process of developing if-then statements, refining them, working on them for like 3 months, 6 months before going into any literature. And then what happens is, then you say, if you're doing a synthesis, you go to the literature, and the literature is now giving you something entirely different. It's sort of, the literature is showing you cutting across the sort of theoretical domain in a different way than you had developed your initial program theories, and you don't really have material in the literature to really accurately sort of test your program theories. So it's a little bit of a back and forth that you have to manage between understanding what is available in the literature and how do those match the relevance of where you want to go with your program theories. So that's a little added point. It's obviously, I can't really go into a lot of detail about that here, but it's just a cautionary message that you could end up working on initial program theories for a long time, perfecting them, and then once you go to the literature, you sort of have to set them all aside because now the literature is telling you something very different. So it's a process. So there are different ways to deal with that, that we can talk about another time. Yeah.
Fantastic. So shall we move on to the penultimate question now? Question 4. So question 4, how do we scale up realist findings when we are focused on specific contexts?
Yeah, so this one comes from the idea that with the realist method, you're really focused on context, as we've already kind of alluded to, around context changing and trying to really get to sort of mine that ontological depth in terms of, feelings, attitudes, behaviors, that kind of thing, or the unobservable stuff. So perhaps people are getting obsessed with the context, and when people want to perhaps try and relate those findings to another area, another environment, then people start to wonder how that can be done. So is there there are ways that can be done, Justin?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, Henry, we were speaking earlier, and you came up, you brought up a really good word to sum up. Like, there's the word generalizability, which it sort of works in an empirical paradigm, but in the realist paradigm, we talk about transferability. And what was the word that you had brought up earlier?
I said portability, so be able to port things from one to others. Yeah.
So portability and transferability are really nice terms to really sum up the logic of realist paradigm when it comes to scale up. Generalizability is something that is a bit more distant from the realist way of thinking, because generalizability comes from a paradigm where the assumption is that science can find some universal truth about a phenomenon or an intervention under study. So you do a massive, say, randomized controlled trial. You find the significant results, and that provides you with sort of a somewhat we're not totally positivistic now. We're post-positivist in this era. So there's an acknowledgement that nothing is universal, but there's still that underlying thread of this logic of generalizability, which is that you can scale up if it was found in the in the trial that intervention works. Then if you scale up with fidelity, then it should work elsewhere. Because it has enough power to handle any contextual differences. So it should work. That's the anticipation, and then you have to monitor to see if it does work, of course. That's a certain kind of positivist, or you may say post-positivist kind of paradigm. The realist paradigm, what is different about the realist paradigm is that our starting point is to say things will work differently in different contexts. We're not looking for a generalizable claim, but we are interested in understanding what is transferable or portable, as you said. What is transferable about what is done in this context to another context? So, even the idea of scale up is something that is not endemic to the realist paradigm. This is, empirical sort of randomized controlled trial kind of ideas thinking. So scale up is this idea of replicating a program with fidelity. Whereas what we are interested in is, saying, okay, if this realist evaluation was studied in this context, then can we transfer those components, those aspects of this program to a similar context and expect similar results, or can we transfer it to a different context and expect similar results? The idea is that when you do an initial realist evaluation on a project in a specific area and you have theorized the specifics of that context, that we're not just trying to scale up in a generalizable way, but we're trying to build capacity for our for our context sensitivity, so that in another context, which is different, we are already sort of farther down the line in theorizing the contribution of context to our causal claims. That even though context will be different, we're not starting from square one, because we've already theorized what is working or what is not working about the first context, the initial context of the study. And because we've already done that, we're developing our capacity for what I would call context sensitivity. We're developing our sensitivity to understanding how context may or may not work, knowing that there are different aspects of context as the intervention, so-called as it scales up. There's a lot more to be said about it. I mean, it's actually a huge topic. So that's the first thing I would say. What do you have any thoughts about that initially? Does that make sense to you?
So for me, I'm just thinking about my areas and the sort of things that I'm doing. So my PhD focused on building capacity with practitioners in being able to do realist evaluation. So kind of, helping and facilitating them in actually carrying it out in their own practice. And that was within a specific context at Solent University with our students at the time. So, this is quite a pertinent question in that where can I take the monitoring and evaluation framework that I had in place? Where could I take it somewhere else into another context and try and mobilize it? And I think the answer to the question is yes, but we're always aware of the potential of the portability, but that we need to be always aware about that context sensitivity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But, what's interesting too is that, context theorizing is difficult because sometimes there are aspects of context that are somewhat invisible to us because it's sort of taken for granted. And what happens is when a program gets transposed onto another context and it doesn't work or it works differently, we may be able to help, that may be helpful for us to theorize aspects of the original context that did work or didn't work. And this is the danger, actually, of atheoretical research and research that does not take into account context, because if you do a study in a certain sort of certain location, and let's face it, it's not a closed system, it's not a laboratory where you're controlling for variables. Even a randomized controlled trial is situated in an open system in a particular context or context. So there might be multiple sites, multiple contexts, of course. But if you're not theorizing the context, then when you do scale up, you may be totally lost in another context when it fails, because you're not thinking about what could be working. So in the original context, say it worked really well, but there could be some key enablers in that context that were really absolutely central to the program functioning in the original context. But in Scaleup, the context is different. One of the examples I've given in a previous webinar is that if you start with a small scale study, say you're working, with practitioners, Kevin, on something in your field, say about helping practitioners become better mentors, and so you train a number of people to be the kind of train the trainer. Have the train the trainer role. But those key people, they're your friends, they're your colleagues, say they're other people who have worked in the field really well, like they've worked they understand you really well, and they're already oriented to what you're trying to do. And so you train them, and then you evaluate that program, and it's hugely successful, hugely successful. So you say, okay, this format, whatever I've done here is really successful, I'm going to scale this up. But when you scale up, now you're going to implement this training program to people that may not have the same level of sort of interest, motivation, orientation, perspective. Some people may be very new to their field. Maybe they're hired right off this, brand new, so they don't have much experience. And so that context difference right away may serve to explain why your original project was very successful, but you may have missed that because you're focused on the specific intervention components and the resources of those components. You're missing, it's possible to miss the sort of innate capacity that people bring to a project. And often there's a lot of resources that get concentrated, context resources that get concentrated in initial study that aren't there in a scale-up situation. So that in scale-up, things are much more diffuse, much more varied in terms of what the context offers, and then you have all this variation and failure and mixed results, etc. So this is where the realist approach can really be helpful in theorizing context to understand how context can support the success and failure, support the success or contribute to the mixed results or the failure of programs.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because in my area in education, particularly in the UK primary school sort of arena, the head teacher is the person, like you're talking about, an enabler. Often the head teacher is the person that either enables or doesn't the use of physical activity in that school. So you take it, like you say, it might work brilliantly in one school because the head teacher is a real fan of it, but the next school, literally down the road, maybe in the same area, but it could be a totally different context within those four walls of the school because of that head teacher who doesn't have as much passion for it or doesn't want to see it as much. So I think that's definitely true in that area as well.
Absolutely, Henry. That's a perfect example of how something as seemingly simple as that can really create massively different results. And if you do a randomized controlled trial where you're just collecting outcome data, individual outcome data based on students, then there's a possibility that it may be missed. I know that there are some efforts being made now to develop context-sensitive randomized controlled trials, and there is some theory-driven trials, and that field is also advancing. But realist evaluation is really sort of the one of the leading paradigms for developing our understanding of context and context-sensitive theorizing. So that to me is very, very exciting about the realist approach.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so last question. Last
question. Yeah. To what extent is this the most burning question of all of them? Let's see. But this question 5, the last one then. What does the future hold for the context mechanism outcome configuration?
Well, the final question, I suppose, in terms of where do we go? Where does it go? Does the CMO configuration have a future? Does it need to be challenged more? Is it difficult for perhaps the lay person, the practitioner, or however you want to call them, to get their head around these difficult jargon, mechanism, context? What does it really mean for them, and how can they apply it? I suppose something like that.
And I think just to add a little bit more substance to that question as well, Justin, is you experience it. It comes up a lot where people, they for example say, "Oh, what's a context?" or "What's an M?" or "What's an O?" And obviously, the most recently we've had the sort of like the development of the CMO with the CMMO, the mechanism resource and mechanism reasoning, for example, through Dalkin et al.'s work. So a kind of there's some people might say that they kind of like run into like the rabbit hole perhaps, or they become a little bit confused with what actually constitutes CMOs, and how can we perhaps translate the CMO language in a little bit less jargonistic way, because what do people really mean by context? What does mechanism really mean? So how do we kind of come through this, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I think you're hitting on a very 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 good question. I think it is a burning question for people about the CMO configuration, and I think in one sense there's a timelessness to it. The idea that there is a context mechanism interaction where everything you see at the empirical level has a corresponding underpinning mechanism that serves to explain its generation is a very powerful sort of general heuristic. It's a very powerful tool, device to understand reality. It's very primitive though. It's very basic. It's not it's not really it's not lauded for its sophistication. It's a very basic principle, which is that if you see observables in the world, we have to a realist. If you may consider yourself a realist, if you go out onto the street and you see observables, things that you can observe, and that you also assume that there are things happening in real time that is beyond observability, that is serving to explain why you're seeing what you're seeing in the real world. Now that's where Pawson and Tilley have come from. I mean, you might find this kind of line of argument in critical realism, but Pawson and Tilley have very clearly distilled this out into this formula that context plus mechanism equals an outcome. So there's an interaction, there's some kind of, and then there's the whole business of including the idea of interventions and evaluation to that. But generally speaking, the CMO configuration, I think, has a timeless quality to it. I think it's something it's close to a universal law. It's like of ontology. So it's a principle of realist ontology, really. But having said that, there is a lot of struggle with using the CMO configuration as a procedural device in realist analysis, in Pawson and Tilley's realist analysis, and people do apply it very faithfully. They try to use the CMO configuration to support a generative causal understanding of their phenomena, of the research questions that they're trying to test. And sometimes it feels like baggage. Sometimes you feel like you're stuck in the straitjacket of CMO. you know, you have an understanding of the mechanism, but then you think, well, what is the context here? Or there's so many different aspects of context. So which one would I pull in for this CMO configuration? And people get really bogged down with that. And I think that, like, from my listening to, you know, Ray Pawson's you know, discussion about the CMO configuration, he is, you know, not to put words in his mouth, this is my interpretation of what he said. You can consult with him directly, but that the CMO configuration is a heuristic. It's a way of thinking. It's an aid memoir. It's a way to remember generative causation, but it's not the final kind of diagram, or it's not the final kind of way that you need to articulate generative causation. And especially if you're talking to practitioners outside of the academic field, you know, this does become jargon, and it becomes not very useful. Yet the underlying principle of it can be very, very useful. So that's the short answer to it. That I think that the future is realist. I think that in my opinion, I feel like we can't afford not to be realist, because the world is very complex, and it's actually the complexity of things is increasing, and the rate of this increase is also increasing. So I mean it's increasing exponentially. So we need to find a paradigm, a research methodology, an approach that cuts through this complexity in a way that is manageable, that we can produce some pragmatic and innovative solutions to addressing important, critical, entrenched problems. And I think the CMO configuration and realist methodology generally is really one of our best shots at doing that. I'm a true believer in Pawson and Tilley's approach, the pragmatic aspect of it, the CMO configuration. But having said that, I think, like I said, there's a lot of discussion to be had about how you can bring this to many people, to a wider audience, without getting bogged down in the jargon of the idea of a CMO configuration. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you agree with that?
I personally agree with where you're coming from. I think there's kind of like 2 points that I would make there in addition to what you said. The first one is that I think the realist methodology, realist evaluation, kind of like the community, is quite nice and open. It's very willing to take on and embrace, you know, the different qualitative or quantitative approaches. And I think it's really important that when people are in the process of developing context mechanism outcomes, and then, you know, testing those CMOs to refine or to create new CMOs, for example, they need to feel not so badly challenged, if that makes sense, because what's popping into my mind there is this idea of, you know, this concept of the CMO police, where sometimes you can feel a bit frightened when you're at a conference and you put your CMOs up on the board and you're worried about what someone's going to say. So I think that we just kind of need to be sensitive and reflexive about, as long as someone can justify, you know, why they have their CMOs in the way that they have, then we should be open to that, basically. So I think that's really important. And then, like, the last point I was just going to make was that I think within practitioner land or within industry contexts, there are ways where, you know, we need to talk about context mechanism and outcomes, but there's ways in which we can translate that jargon into maybe more simplistic or more understandable language.
Yeah, absolutely. And Henry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, actually, you were talking about Ray Pawson himself, about, you know, not putting words into his mouth, really, but I think we've all been lucky enough to hear him talk or meet him and stuff, and know that he's quite open as well about how perhaps the CMO configuration can be, you know, looked at. And I think I've heard him talk about, you know, should it be mechanisms first, and what should it be, and how can we work together to try and make it, you know, challenge it and look to develop it. So I think, you know, even from the horse's mouth, there's you know, evidence to suggest it could be taken on in different ways, or used in different ways, or applied in different ways. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And see, if the logic is sound, like if the generative causal logic, that there are mechanisms and they relate to context, if that is there, then we may play around with the actual kind of articulation of the CMO. Resource going into context, leading to reasoning, as Sonia's Sonia and colleagues have suggested, and process, as a mechanism, context, outcome. And how do you define mechanisms? Do you disaggregate into resource and reasoning? Do you just keep it as a singular concept? And there's all these different possibilities and then diagramming the CMO configuration. There's all kinds of possibilities. So it's an open field, and that's what's also quite appealing, is that if you stick to the principles, if you adhere to the principles of the positive scientific realist approach, then there is some wiggle room where you may innovate the methodology and customize it to your field or your research questions. And sometimes that is necessary. And through that process of customizing, we're really activating our thinking about what really matters in the work that we're studying. What's at the crux of it? What's generating what we're seeing, and why? And if you stick to those general questions using the CMO as a heuristic, then you're bound to be successful, I think.
Great success. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so I think now is maybe a good time to draw the webinar to a close. Thank you, Justin, for providing such an excellent array of answers to our questions in terms of the insight that you've given. It's fantastic. And for those who are those of you viewing the webinar, myself, Henry, and Justin hope that you found it useful to support you in terms of where you are with the work that you're doing in your realist evaluation, and you feel that there's relevance to work. And if there's anything that you wanted to say, Henry?
No, well, hopefully like it resonates with people that perhaps are well into their research in the realist methods, and perhaps people that have just started to think about certain things. So as we've said there's plenty more to discuss. It's just perhaps a good place for people to come to answer some of their burning issues or questions that perhaps are more relevant to them and to their work. So hopefully it will be helpful.
So Justin, any final comments from yourself?
Just thank you for the opportunity to discuss and putting together those questions. Those were great questions. And yeah, similar, I hope that this was beneficial, and just wanted to wish you the very best with the launch of your new research group, the Solent University Realist Research Group. So that's very exciting to see that you're moving ahead with that, Kevin and Henry. So best of luck with that. And
yeah, and the same with you, Justin, with your care stuff that you're doing as well. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we are concluding now. So okay, signing off.